All right, today's lecture is going to be on the chemistry of life. And it's basically going to be an overview of Regents chemistry, maybe a little bit of AP chemistry, uh, but really just the things that are fundamental to understanding how life works. Now, really having a good understanding of chemistry is super important to understanding biology. In fact, it was my organic chemistry classes in college that really helped me to understand and have a really good grasp on exactly what life is and what biology is. So chemistry is super important, but we're going to kind of go over the things that you really need to know to help you understand, how proteins fold, why, how energy is transformed in our bodies and things like that. So in order to do that, you have to have kind of this baseline understanding of how chemistry works. Now, you may have heard this before, but there are like four major elements that make up a majority of molecules that are found in our bodies. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up 96% of life, as it says here. And those are the molecules that make up basically, or the elements that make up every single molecule that you have that is a biomolecule in your body, or an organic molecule. There are other elements as well, such as calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. Each of those has kind of important roles. Like, for example, calcium is important in your bones, but not just that, also in communication within your cells. Phosphorus is an important component of ATP, which is biological energy. That's what the P stands for, phosphate groups. Potassium is involved in nerve function, along with sodium and chlorine. Sulfur is important in the way proteins fold, and proteins do like everything in your body. So as you can see here, there's all these important roles for these different elements. And then you have trace elements, which are found in a lot smaller percentages, but they're still very important to life, and they have important roles. They just don't make up the bulk of your body mass. So when you started with chemistry in chemistry class, one of the first things you learn is that everything is made up of matter. Okay, and that matter is made up of atoms, and atoms are the basic building block of all matter. So each atom, though, has smaller parts to it. For example, protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge, and neutrons have a neutral charge. But it's the protons and the neutrons that provide the majority of the mass of the atom, whereas electrons basically have negligible amounts of mass. What we're going to focus the most on in this course is electrons and the flow of electrons, because the flow of electrons is basically electricity, but we can actually in our bodies take the flow of electrons as we pass and do oxidation and reduction reactions to different proteins and different molecules in our body. We can transfer that potential energy into chemical energy that we can use in the form of ATP. So you want to make sure you understand electrons, because electrons and oxidation reduction reactions are super important. And here's just showing you a periodic table of a lot of the important elements we just discussed, the ones that were on that list. I'm going to briefly discuss isotopes. Now, isotopes are the same element, but they have different molecular masses because they have different numbers of neutrons. So an element is basically characterized by the number of protons it has, but it can differ in the number of neutrons. The more the number of neutrons differs from the number of protons, you usually become more unstable and they become possibly radioactive. So we do talk about radioactive tags and things like that and radioactivity in certain respects throughout this course. I mean, one way we kind of talk about it is when we talk about cancer treatments, when we get into mitosis and how mitosis and issues with the mitotic cycle and the cell cycle can cause cancer. But radioactive isotopes will give off random particles such as beta and alpha particles and release energy, and a lot of times it's kind of dangerous for our bodies, and that's what results in changes in DNA, which are called mutations. Chemicals tend to react with other chemicals, or elements tend to react with other elements depending on how filled their valence shell is. Now, if you remember, in most elements, and especially the ones that we're going to talk about, with the exception of hydrogen, have a valence of 8. Okay, they want to have 8 electrons in their outer shell. But most elements have, with the exception of the noble gases, have shells that are not completely filled. when you look at the one side of the periodic table, you have your halides, and the halides have 7 electrons in their outer shell. On the other side, you have your group 1 metals, and those metals have 1 electron in their valence shell. So the group 1 metals are going to want to get rid of that electron, and the halides are going to want to take that electron. Okay, and this drive to make that valence shell full, having 8, is what drives chemical bonds, or drives chemical reactions and creates chemical bonds. So we're going to talk a lot about energy. We actually have a whole unit devoted to energy and the Gibbs free energy constant, or equation, if you remember that, if you took AP Chem. But it is the capacity to cause change. And the two main types that we have are potential energy, which is the energy of either location or structure. It's kind of like stored energy that has the potential to be used later. Whereas kinetic energy is once that energy is being used, and it's being used to cause movement. It's the energy of motion. The major type of, the way I like to discuss this is with temperature. Now the definition of temperature is average kinetic energy. So that's what temperature is. As you add heat energy to substances, to matter, it helps to speed up their molecules. So the molecules move more, thus their kinetic energy increases. And that's why temperature is technically a measurement of average kinetic energy. Now getting back to the whole valence electron thing, we're going to talk a little bit about covalent and ionic bonds. A covalent bond, as you remember, hopefully, is the sharing of valence electrons, and usually that's between 2 nonmetals. In this case, you can see hydrogen is a nonmetal and oxygen is a nonmetal, and both of them are sharing electrons. In this case, they're 2 nonpolar covalent bonds and nonpolar molecules, hydrogen and oxygen. But in this case, they share electrons to fill out that valence shell, as opposed to donating and receiving electrons, which we'll talk about in a second. Electronegativity, which is related to this, is the attractiveness of a particular element of an element for electrons. So electrons have more of an attraction to certain elements than others. The halides are super electronegative, with fluorine being the most electronegative of those. That means it really loves electrons. And because of that, even when you find these electronegative elements randomly throughout biomolecules, it's going to draw electron density towards them. So they're going to become more electronegative. And then other parts of the molecule will become more electropositive, resulting in a molecule that is considered to be polar. So in a nonpolar covalent bond, it's usually between 2 atoms that are the exact same, have the same exact electronegativity. So usually it's 2 of the same elements, like in this case 2 hydrogen atoms bond together. So their pull of electrons is going to be equal, so there's not going to be any unequal sharing of electrons between the two. But in a polar covalent bond, as you can see here, the electrons are being pulled or drawn towards the chlorine, which is much more electronegative. So chlorine is going to end up having a partial negative charge to it, and the hydrogen is going to end up having, because it is more electropositive, a partial positive charge to it, resulting in a polar molecule. In ionic bonds, that happens when you have usually a metal and a nonmetal, and the nonmetal will take the electron from the metal, because the metal will fill its outer shell easiest by removing an electron or two. And the nonmetal will remove, or will gain its octet the easiest, or its full outer shell the easiest, by taking electrons. So when they find a pair that works, they will react with each other. When you do this, you tend to generate ions. Anions are negatively charged, and cations are positively charged. And because you then generate these anions and cations, and one of the most important rules in physics, or in the universe in general, is that opposites attract, positives attract negatives, those ions will then stick together and form what's called an ionic bond. So you can see here, it's in the attraction between those 2 anions. And this is showing you salt, NaCl, and how it forms a crystalline structure when dry, but when it mixes with water, because water is polar, as we'll talk about in our next lecture, it tends to dissolve the sodium and the chlorine ions in solution. This is showing you another visual representation of that idea that the electron density is pulled towards one side or the other. Non-polar covalent bonds, you have equal pull. In polar covalent bonds, you have an unequal pull with more electron density on the electronegative side. And in the ionic bond, you have an actual complete transfer of electrons, generating a positive ion and a negative ion. There are other important bonds, or as I'd call them, intermolecular forces. Hydrogen bonds, they're weak bonds between a hydrogen of one molecule and an electronegative element of another one. Usually it's oxygen, but it can be others. But in terms of life, it's usually oxygen, especially water molecules sticking to each other, or proteins with hydrogens and oxygens in them. Sulfur bonds and disulfide bonds are weak bonds that usually form between proteins and in other places. Like in this case, they're showing one on an antibody in that Y-shaped protein that's on top. And it's important for holding protein structure together. And the van der Waals forces, which are these weak momentary forces like dipole moments that exist in molecules, and that's actually how geckos can climb up walls and lizards can climb up walls, is because they have these dipole moments in molecules in the tips of their fingers and toes. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is chemical reactions. Now you remember, the reactants are what goes in and the product is what comes out. In this case, it's showing hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, both reactants, and the product, which ends up being water. Notice how it's a balanced reaction. You want to make sure you know how to balance too. That's kind of an important thing to remember how to do. And the most important one we talk about in our class, or the most important ones, I should say, because they're kind of one and the same but not at the same time, are photosynthesis and respiration. Now, one is the reverse of the other. So you have carbon dioxide and water going to C6H12O6 and oxygen. If we're talking about that as being the forward reaction, that's photosynthesis. In order to do that, what you're going to do is you're taking carbon dioxide and water and kind of putting them together, and you're forming a more complicated molecule. In order to do that, you have to put energy in the form of light. The reverse reaction is respiration, and in order to do that, what you do is you take the more complicated molecule, the sugar, and you add oxygen, and what you're going to do is you're actually going to pull energy out of that molecule in the form of ATP, and you generate carbon dioxide and water as byproduct. So one reaction is the forward reaction, the other reaction is the reverse reaction. It's just, does energy go in or does energy come out? All right, so that is your brief overview of chemistry and the chemistry that's important to understand for biology. We're going to get a little bit next time into water and eventually these biomolecules and why they're important for life. I hope that helped, and if you have any questions, let me know.